Hello, good morning, everyone. Welcome to A World That Works, Naked Conversations, Part 2. And the general theme of this is basically the implementation of a lot of the stuff that we've been developing in the introductory videos, including the Big Picture Part 1, the Big Picture Part 2, and the one that precedes that, which is the 5-minute introductory video, What Radish is Up To, aka the Hungerless Games. So building off of all that, we want to talk implementation, but at the same time, we never quite leave the conversation of exactly what is it that we want to implement, what's priority, why, what other options exist for solving the world's problems. And it's very much an open source exploration. Everyone's invited to participate. We're working on getting the social network on Radish launched. Until then, we simply have these video conferences or sometimes video monologues such as this one. And my philosophy is we got to start somewhere. So we're just starting with this. Let me talk briefly about a couple of books that I'm reading. One is A Theory of Fields by Doug McAdam and Neil Fligstein. These are professors at Stanford and Berkeley, and they've been working for, I think, like 25 years or something on this amazing theory of fields. And in it, they discuss the central concept of a strategic action field. Strategic action fields can be governments, they can be corporations, they can be social movements, environmental movements. Much of what we're doing constitutes strategic action fields. Radish itself is a strategic action field. The compassionate economy with CCC is a strategic action field. A higher form of intelligence, as we've conceived of it, is a strategic action field. So is the next level, a higher form of intelligence squared. So I want to jump in with some high-level thoughts that I've been kicking around. And this is very much in the paradigm of practice. This is all practice. There are no perfect presentations. We just jump in and get started. And then over time, we synthesize what we're doing. So synthesis is a key part of it. It's the summarization. And I apologize for any background noise. I think they're doing some yard work here next door, or some plumbing work or something. Anyway, as you can see on the screen here in this Word document, I just list some of the multiple crises facing humanity and the planet. And what's striking is that the crises themselves are gargantuan. Each one in and of themselves is huge, absolutely huge. And the fact that so many of these gargantuan crises are staring us in the face all at once, and the problems are actually growing, both individually and the compound compendium of all the problems is also growing, the compound nature. It kind of begs the question, why aren't like all of us talking about how to solve it? Well, the answer is all of us are talking about how to solve these problems. It's just that we're talking about them in ways which are familiar to us. Very notably, well, what should government do? Or who should we vote for, to lead the next government? And embedded within that is the assumption that government has it within its means to address these problems effectively, which it doesn't necessarily have. I'm just going to kind of skip ahead here. So I wrote some notes about deadlock within governments and the need for new strategic action fields. So many of our problems, I'm just going to highlight the stuff I'm going to be talking about. So many of our problems are global in nature, yet we're addressing them as a few hundred individual nations, each one acting essentially as an island unto itself. Each nation is saying, okay, what do we Americans want to do? What do we Mexicans want to do? But there's very little in the way of global governance going on. I mean, yes, there is the United Nations, and there's conversations at the level of, say, protocols such as the Kyoto Protocol. But if we embrace the hypothesis that nation-centric governance is a bit obsolete and dysfunctional at addressing these global problems, And there's a certain degree of dysfunctionality in national governments, period, regardless of global problems, even just in the face of national problems. But one way to think of the UN is the union of dysfunctional, nation-centric strategic action fields, the current national governments being a set of strategic action fields. And global governments, which is sorely needed. In hindsight, I believe, maybe 5, 10, 20 years from now, whenever, there's a significant, and it could be a lot sooner than that, sometime in the future when we have clarity on all this stuff, much better clarity, in hindsight, it will be obvious that global governance was needed all along and is sorely needed now. In fact, without global governance, one way to think of it is the world is kind of like the Wild West of the United States during, I don't know, the 1700s, where a bunch of roaming mobs are doing whatever they want. And yes, there is dysfunctional leadership within the mobs, but each mob is basically out to get what it can for itself. So for example, if you look at the Arctic today, you've got Russia and China and the United States and all these countries seeing what they can, how they can, strategically exploit the Arctic, focusing on national interests with very little emphasis on the global problems that we're all facing. So I think kind of like the roaming mob analogy in the Wild West is probably pretty good, because again, these nations are acting out of their own nation-centric myopic interest. What's best for me, what's best for my country, my people, etc. And that's, probably seen as a critical factor for getting elected or for maintaining power, is that you have this nation centricity. But it's certainly not doing well for the planet as a whole, with all the externalities and the global problems we're facing that we looked at a minute ago. So let's take a look at some new strategic action fields that are emerging at the global level. One, we have technology. Technology spreads around the world, and so it's not something that can easily be contained within national borders. So that's definitely a strategic action field. Now, most technology around the world has contributed to the problems that we're facing, but some, very notably solar power and technologies of communication and collaboration, are empowering the solution. In fact, both levels of the higher form of intelligence, HFI and HFI squared, are very much empowered by technology. So technology is a major player, can be positive, can be negative, can be both, depending on the technology in terms of the impact. The second is the Catholic Church. We look at the position that Pope Francis is taking, the leadership that he's exhibiting at the global level as far as these global problems are concerned. Then you also have private foundations, which are making quite a difference at the international level, thinking globally, such as the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And then, of course, the new stuff that we're proposing new strategic action fields, abbreviated as SAFs, such as the compassionate economy and its standard CCC, a higher form of intelligence, the one that is human-based, that I discuss in detail in the Big Picture Part 1, and then HFI squared. There it says HFI 2. So let me change that to a superscript. How do I do that? Superscript, there we go. Oh, it didn't do it. Well, anyway, HFI squared is the dialectic between the higher form of intelligence, which is fundamentally human-based intelligence, and the worldwide operating system, or the whole world operating system, and the layers built on top of that, which is the topic of the Big Picture Part 2. Well worth rewatching if you want to get a refresher on that. And what's interesting here is that both the HFI and the HFI squared constitute platforms. There, I finally got it. HFI squared. Both of these constitute platforms for generating, in turn, new strategic action fields. So, for example, CCC was developed with I'll just say conventional collaborative intelligence between a handful of people working together. a higher form of intelligence will not only be able to refine and perfect Triple C, but also generate whole new strategic action fields, many as mashups between existing concepts and fields, many totally brand new. I mean, what we can do with a vastly higher form of intelligence than what we think of, than what we're aware of, or have what the world has seen to date in terms of terrestrial intelligence, human-based and otherwise. There's just, I believe there will be no comparison, that we're going to be able to transform the world's problems in very powerful ways with this new intelligence. And then, of course, bring in HFI squared, and it'll be utterly profound. So new strategic action fields and the platforms that will enable them, such as HFI and HFI squared. Really profound stuff. Now, getting back to the magnitude of these problems, because they're so big, in fact, let's just take a little detour. There's this great article. Here it is. I had mentioned this in the Big Picture Part 1. The title of the article, and this appeared in Mother Jones, is "We're Destroying the Planet in Ways That Are Even Worse Than Global Warming." And this is dark stuff, but part of the delving into the darkness is kind of necessary. I mean, take a look at the title of this book, which I mentioned in the Big Picture Part 1. Don't even think about it. Why our brains are wired to ignore climate change. I think it's sort of an obvious corollary that there could be a sequel to this book. Don't even think about it. 2. Why, Part 2, why our brains are wired to ignore all these major problems, because they're really, really devastating, and it's really, really hard to look at and wrap your head around. And then deal with the cognitive dissonance of, I'm actually causing the problem. If you are watching this, chances are you're one of the billion or so who are really driving climate change and natural resource depletion just by our very habits of consumption, and transportation, and the homes that we live in, and the neighborhoods, and how we get around, and what we do with our time, and what we do with our resources. So humans are eating away at our own life support systems at a rate unseen in the past 10,000 years by degrading land and freshwater systems, emitting greenhouse gases, and releasing vast amounts of agricultural chemicals into the environment. New research has found. And now I'm just going to skip around and read stuff that really kind of jumps out. Of 9 worldwide processes that underpin life on Earth, 4 have exceeded safe levels. Climate change, loss of biosphere integrity, land system change like deforestation, and the high level of phosphorus and nitrogen flowing into the oceans due to fertilizer use. This is interesting. They found that the changes of the past 60 years are unprecedented in the previous 10,000 years, a period in which the world has had a relatively stable climate and human civilization has advanced significantly. So CO2 levels are at historic highs and rising. They just passed the 400 parts per million mark. Here's kind of the big picture of sort of like the 9 key, pillars to life being, suitable, livable, planetary boundaries, and you can see which ones have surpassed their respective safe zones. Since 1950, urban populations have increased 7-fold. Primary energy use is soared by a factor of 5. Well, the amount of fertilizer used is now 8 times higher. So, I mean, just look at these multiples of where we were in 1950, not that long ago. And the amount of nitrogen entering the oceans has quadrupled. All of these changes are shifting Earth into a new state that is becoming less hospitable to human life, researchers said. We are clearing land, we are degrading land, we introduce feral animals and take the top predators out. We change the marine ecosystem by overfishing. It's death by 1,000 cuts. That direct impact upon the land is the most important factor right now, even more than climate change. It's fairly safe to say that we haven't seen conditions in the past similar to ones we see today, and there is strong evidence that there are tipping points we don't want to cross. If the Earth is going to move to a warmer state, 5 to 6 degrees Celsius warmer with no ice caps, it will do so, and that won't be good for large mammals like us. People say the world is robust, and that's true. There will be life on Earth, but the Earth won't be robust for us. So we're literally very rapidly making planet Earth inhospitable for humans. And it's more like we're setting all these time bombs now. I mean, human populations continue to rise. In fact, that's, of course, what I argue is one of the major problems, perhaps the major problem. And so, we're not dying, we're not going extinct yet, but we're creating the conditions where humanity may possibly go extinct, or at least contract substantially after having caused massive devastation to itself and the many, many species which are currently going extinct. And in fact, so let me just read a little bit more here, and then I want to read from yet another book. It's clear the economic system is driving us towards an unsustainable future, and people of my daughter's generation will find it increasingly hard to survive. History has shown that civilizations have risen, stuck to their core values, and then collapsed because they didn't change. That's where we are today. So we're kind of repeating history here. Now let me read to you from this great book. Let me go back to normal video mode here. Are we back? Yes, we're back. Okay. So the book is called The Sixth Extinction, and I mentioned this book, and I show its cover in the Big Picture Part 1. But let me just read from the very introduction. This is kind of fascinating. If you look at humanity sort of on a big picture level, going back 50,000 years, 100,000 years. Beginnings, this is a prologue to the book. Its beginnings, it is said, are apt to be shadowy. So it is with this story, which starts with the emergence of a new species, maybe 200,000 years ago. The species does not yet have a name, nothing does, but it has the capacity to name things, to give names to things. As with any young species, this one's position is precarious. Its numbers are small and its range restricted to a slice of Eastern Africa. This is the early days of humanity. Slowly its population grows, but quite possibly then it contracts again. Some would claim nearly fatally to just a few thousand pairs. Can you imagine just a few thousand pairs of humans, men and women, compared to the several billion, the few billion pairs that we have today? It's mind-boggling. That's 1/1,000,000th the magnitude of population. The members of the species are not particularly swift or strong or fertile. They are, however, singularly resourceful. Gradually, they push into regions with different climates, different predators, and different prey. None of the usual constraints of habitat or geography seem to check them. They cross rivers, plateaus, mountain ranges. In coastal regions, they gather shellfish. Farther inland, they hunt mammals. Everywhere they settle, they adapt and innovate. On reaching Europe, they encounter creatures very much like themselves, but stockier and probably brawnier, who have been living on the continent far longer. They interbreed with these creatures and then, by one means or another, kill them off. And so we're kind of a brutal species. We kill off other species. The end of this affair will turn out to be exemplary. As the species expands its range, it crosses paths with animals twice, 10, and even 20 times its size. Huge cats, towering bears, turtles as big as elephants, sloths that stand 15 feet tall. These species are more powerful and often fiercer, but they are slow to breed and are wiped out. Although a land animal, our species, ever inventive, crosses the sea, it reaches islands inhabited by evolution's outliers. Birds that lay foot-long eggs, pig-sized hippos, giant skinks. Accustomed to isolation, these creatures are ill-equipped to deal with the newcomers or their fellow travelers, mostly rats. Most of them, too, succumb. The process continues in fits and starts for thousands of years. So for thousands of years, humanity is expanding. It's just in this expansion and takeover mode until the species, no longer so new, has spread to practically every corner of the globe. At this point, several things happen more or less at once that allow Homo sapiens, as it has come to call itself, to reproduce at an unprecedented rate. In a single century, the population doubles. Then it doubles again. And then again. Vast forests are raised. Humans do this deliberately in order to feed themselves. I mean, think about just the great, not great in the wonderful term, but in terms of magnitude, the great migrations and expansions of humanity. Think about the expansion of humanity, including my ancestors, across North America. When, frontiers families, settlers who were clearing land and growing crops, they were having 10 kids. My grandfather was the youngest of 13 children. Youngest of 13. Then it started to slow down in the past several decades. My father was one of 7 children. And in wealthy societies, the rate of birth per number of children per family has declined, but in poor societies, and of course the United States was poor, economically speaking, while this process of massive overpopulation was happening, and it's poverty that continues to drive overpopulation. Again, I apologize for all the noise out here, but So let me just finish off reading this. Actually, no, this is a good time to take a look at population trends. So let's go to screen share and just explore this. Present to everyone, okay. So let's just look at, world population history. Let's just look at the history of world population. There ought to be some nice graph. Okay, so what do we got here? Here's a graph. Okay, so we crossed 1 billion people at around 1800. And then there was a steady climb. It took us 120 years to go from 1 billion, about 125 years to go from 1 billion to 2 billion. And then we added the next billion from about, let's call it 1925 to 1960. A little after 1960, or a little before 1960. So that was about 30, call it 35 years for adding the next billion. And then we added the next billion in what appears to be like, 18 years or something, from 3 to 4. And in that period, I was born. I was one of them. And then we added the next billion in about, what does that look like? Maybe another 13 years or so. And then another billion in maybe like what appears to be 10 years. Could it be that little? In about 10 years, 10, 11 years. And then we added the last billion in about apparently 12 years, 12, 13 years. And now we're at over 7 billion. I mean, this thing is just shooting up. And of course, there's different estimates. There's a high estimate, a medium estimate, a low estimate. I mean, come on. People are predicting it's just going to crest and start to fall. The thing is, nobody knows is part of the problem. I mean, it is truly unknowable. But just look at that trajectory. It's just insane. We're just growing like wildfire. This is an emergency. And we see the results of this emergency as we look at this article that I've now referenced a couple of times and read from. But anyway, back to the book, The Sixth Extinction. I'm just reading a little bit more from the preface here. Humans, so vast forests are raised. Humans do this deliberately in order to feed themselves. Less deliberately, they shift organisms from one continent to another, reassembling the biosphere. And I point to biosphere integrity as being one of the major tipping points that we've crossed as a planet. Meanwhile, an even stranger and more radical transformation is underway. Having discovered subterranean reserves of energy, humans begin to change the composition of the atmosphere. This in turn alters the climate and the chemistry of the oceans. Some plants and animals adjust by moving. They climb mountains and migrate towards the poles. But a great many, at first hundreds, then thousands, and finally perhaps millions, find themselves marooned. Extinction rates soar, and the texture of life changes. No creature has ever altered life on the planet in this way before, and yet other comparable events have occurred. Very, very occasionally in the distant past, the planet has undergone change so wrenching that the diversity of life has plummeted. 5 of these ancient events were catastrophic enough that they're put in their own category, the so-called Big Five. In what seems like a fantastic coincidence, but is probably no coincidence at all, the history of these events is recovered just as people come to realize that they are causing another one. When it is still too early to say whether it will reach the proportions of the Big Five, it becomes known as the Sixth Extinction, the title of this book. The story of the Sixth Extinction, at least as I've chosen to tell it, comes in 13 chapters. Each tracks a species that's in some way emblematic. The American mastodon, the great auk, the ammonite that disappeared at the end of the Cretaceous alongside the dinosaurs. The creatures in the early chapters are already gone in this book, and this part of the book is mostly concerned with the great extinctions of the past and the twisting history of their discovery, starting with the work of French naturalist Georges Cuvier. The second part of the book takes place very much in the present, in the increasingly fragmented Amazon rainforest, on a fast-warming slope in the Andes, on the outer reaches of the Great Barrier Reef. I chose to go to these particular places for the usual journalistic reasons, because there was a research station there or because someone invited me to tag along on an expedition. Such is the scope of the changes now taking place that I could have gone pretty much anywhere and, with proper guidance, found signs of them. One chapter concerns a die-off happening more or less in my own backyard and quite possibly in yours. If extinction is a morbid topic, mass extinction is, well, massively so. This is a massively morbid topic. Remember, I talked about we're going to go into the kind of the depths of darkness here. It's also a fascinating one. In the pages that follow, I try to convey both sides, the excitement of what's being learned as well as the horror of it. My hope is that readers of this book will come away with an appreciation of the truly extraordinary moment in which we live. That's the prologue of the Sixth Extinction. We are living in an truly extraordinary moment on so many levels. And I'll go back to screen sharing here. again, just pointing briefly to the article, we're destroying the planet in so many ways, ways that are even worse than global warming. It's a great article. I mean, a depressing article. So much of this stuff is depressing. The title of this book is depressing. Don't even think about it. Why our brains are wired to ignore climate change. But that's just a microcosm of much bigger destructive forces at work. It's just one example. And hence the need for some major transformations. We need to seriously transform life on Earth if we're going to survive this experience, if we're going to get through this moment without just a few more decades of just catastrophic devastation, irreversible devastation. Species loss is irreversible. Sea level rise is largely irreversible in any meaningful time frame. And then, of course, the vicious cycles surrounding climate change, sea level rise, desertification, trapped greenhouse gases being released from melting permafrost, polar ice caps that used to reflect sunlight back into space are now absorbing sunlight with the dark water. And since big problems call for big solutions, the solutions that we're coming up with are strategic action fields which really constitute platforms which can then beget multiple specific solutions for specific industries, for specific geographies, for specific populations, etc. And of course, just to review here, because this is kind of an interesting sort of escalation in platforms, in new strategic action fields. So focusing on the right-hand side here, the left-hand side is kind of like the goal of what we want to achieve, stated as a problem that we want to solve, and what is the solution. So eradicating hunger, compassionate economy is the solution. And the compassionate economy was conceived of without the benefit of a higher form of intelligence. It was just a bunch of us working together pretty intensively to say, okay, what kind of an economy would generate a sustainable, compassionate, peaceful, loving world? The next level up is a much bigger problem, eradicating poverty. That calls for a higher form of intelligence. Hence the focus on a higher form of intelligence. And now, of course, we're actually doing these two simultaneously. When we talk about the implementation of all this, I'm saying, hey, let's start with a higher form of intelligence in the form of, or starting with the basic structure of it, which would be, again, there's the sketch that I worked on with my mom a few nights ago. And here it is in the form of PowerPoint. Map out the basic teleological taxonomy. I later refer to this simply as a wixonomy, a wiki taxonomy of the world's issues, where we want to get to, what is our goal, a world that works, the pillars of that, well-being of people, health of the planet, and the various things, the various topics, the various forcings, the various issues and opportunities that impact both the end goals that we want to achieve and the things which in turn impact the end goals. Overpopulation is among the biggest problems, probably the single biggest, causing all these problems. But then, well, what are the things that cause overpopulation? These are pretty well known and can be known much better, particularly as we pool our knowledge, pool our expertise, and literally create this higher form of intelligence. And the higher form of intelligence, it's just such an appealing topic. It's such a vital topic that I think I'll just go ahead and do a brief review of some of the key elements of it. I was going to apologize for all the whisking around here, skipping around. But again, I think that my ego and my wanting to always look good has really been an impediment. So that's partly why I called this series Naked Conversations. This is getting out of the way of my own ego, or setting my ego aside as best I can. So the strategy is, so the higher form of intelligence is not and will not be born out of a vacuum. It's born out of the eradication of hunger, making that the core initial goal. That's kind of our first milestone. And the eradication of hunger, as I discussed in detail in the big picture part 1, will generate massive unity among humanity. We then take that unity, that social capital, that political capital, if you will, that community capital, and we leverage it to build a higher form of intelligence. And in reality, we're doing both of these simultaneously because we're already launching the higher form of intelligence, as discussed in the last video, Naked Conversations Part 1, and the one before that, A World That Works. Okay, so the higher form of intelligence, the big high-level strategy is create it, leveraging the unity, and the objective is to solve all the world's problems. What are the elements of this? Human processing power. And we talk about Google Hangouts, which I'm using right now. And there are multiple platforms for collaborative video conferences that can be recorded. I just use Google Hangouts because they're very reliable and free and very easy to use. And because they can be saved as YouTube videos. Now, the beautiful thing, and you can see, and I just love this image right here, is that you can see how all these people coming together, it's like suddenly they're aligned. They're in different parts of the country or different parts of the world, in fact. And they're coming together and co-creating. They're focusing on a specific topic and they're turning their brain power towards advancing that topic. It's really that simple. So human processing power, it's kind of like aligning a bunch of batteries such that they're pointing in the same direction. The polarity of the batteries are all aligned. We've seen too many examples of humans fighting each other, working against each other, suing each other, waging war against each other. Imagine we get humanity to align towards a central aim. And now I'm going to hop and skip over to the other presentation. What is the aim that we're proposing here? Well, one view of it, and of course there can be multiple, hence the Wiksonomy, the wiki taxonomy, where multiple taxonomies can be incorporated. But ultimately, I believe we should and must get the entire world aligned towards a central aim of essentially saving this place from the jaws of defeat, and generating a world that works. So with this Wiksonomy, and of course that gets to the structure part, it's also intimately interrelated, but we'll be able to align the brain power towards working towards a central aim, a central goal. And of course, the first goal is the unity generated by ending world hunger, because that's the one problem everyone can pretty much agree. That's a really bad problem. We should solve it. Let's solve it. Okay, great. So we forge the unity. In other words, create that unity, generate that unity, then leverage that unity capital, so to speak, for advancing much more complex aims and goals. The holy grail, of course, being a world that works. And then, of course, so that's the brain power alignment. Just think Google Hangouts aligning brain power. The next is perfect memory. Well, of course, we can save these Hangouts, like the Hangout I'm doing right now is being saved as a YouTube video as I speak. So perfect memory. Unified purpose, we talked about that. Start with the aim of ending hunger. All over that. Leverage the cannabis and hemp industry as the wonderful media platform that it's become for us. And then, of course, expand the aim beyond hunger to transforming all the world's problems as we see in the teleological taxonomy. Right. Whoops. Right here. That becomes the ultimate aim. It's a composite aim. It's an aim that leads us down multiple paths depending on our area of expertise. See, the whole point here is you'll have multiple groups of of humans, of people, concentrating on these topics. The climate change scientists can congregate here and help us to see the impacts and forecast the impacts and communicate those broadly and overcome the horrific barrier of don't even think about it, right? And so back to the core of the higher form of intelligence. So unified aim, and then structures for organizing information and knowledge, the taxonomies, the Wixonomy, like we talked about. And then I go more into taxonomies. But one key point that I want to reemphasize about taxonomies is that the structure of the taxonomies, or the Wixonomy, leads to perspective. And Nathan Myhrvold, one of the smartest people I know, is famously known for saying perspective is worth 30 IQ points. And he's talking about the perspective of a single human brain and the perspective that one develops over time, over the course of living and learning and working, and trying different things and traveling to different places. And of course, Nathan has massive perspective spanning multiple different topics. And so, you know, if that gives us one kind of perspective, what about the perspective of an entire community and intelligence at the level of community? So as you can tell, I'm a big fan of a higher form of intelligence. And, you know, we've got, with just what I've outlined, we can very readily put together, assemble all the basic elements and watch what this new machinery can do, this new human machinery, this new organization of humanity that I call the HFI, the higher form of intelligence. And I'll just send a quick text here. So there you have it. Where do we go from here? Well, it's time to simply do this. It's time to simply build it. Build the higher form of intelligence, build out this Wixonomy, leverage the software like you can see on beyondmastering.com, the brain software, which we're going to be implementing on Radish for building out the Wixonomy, right? Play around with it. It's just really exciting stuff. And just imagine that mashed up with social network functionality. It's like, yeah, let's just freaking do this. And then of course, one just amazing gold nugget that I've, you know, recently been tapping into, and we'll reach out to probably once I get back from Japan, or maybe while I'm in Japan, reach out, is Professor Terry Tao of UCLA, who was either the pioneer or one of the early pioneers in Project Polymath. And it's interesting. Let's look up the definition of polymath. Polymath, let's just look up the word. There ought to be a Wikipedia. A person of wide-ranging knowledge or learning. So this is fascinating. Now what Terry and company have done is taken that concept and built a community of people expanding their knowledge and working in multiple different areas of mathematics. And I kind of love this tagline here. One Da Vinci changed the world. Let's create thousands. Imagine thousands of Da Vincis who can change the world. Or, as I'm suggesting here, let's create one higher form of intelligence, or perhaps multiple higher forms of intelligence, where, you know, you've got a whole community of Da Vincis working together, or simply a whole community of ordinary people, including ordinary engineers, ordinary scientists, ordinary government folks, working together as a higher form of intelligence, which of course can include any number of Da Vincis. So the Polymath project, and then I of course put it in its sort of in its context here, where it can the Polymath project itself can even be part of the higher form of intelligence, as well as geniuses or genii such as Terry Tao, as pictured here. This is just one strand of this ever-growing, expanding Wixonomy. And if you consider the power of mathematics as a language, as a field, as a set of tools for transforming so much of what we're working on today, you know, another related field is economics. And I've mentioned the great work by Professor Banerjee and Professor Duflo at MIT in leveraging economics and models and studies to find out what is most effective for eradicating poverty, for ending poverty. So you've got all these potential synergies between fields. They just need to be developed. And that's not to suggest that these synergies don't exist today. It's just that they do not exist today within the structure of a higher form of intelligence, within the structure of a Wixonomy, for starters. But of course, the Wixonomy is just the starting point. Think of all the elements of a higher form of intelligence, right? The group collaboration, bringing together the various different minds from within the same field. I mean, you can imagine the polymath folks organizing a Google Hangout. In fact, maybe that's one of the things that we should do, is get a Google Hangout with the polymath folks to find out what they've learned and developed, the evolution of the polymath project over the course of time, because we essentially want to create a polymath project for all of human knowledge, particularly as it pertains to the telos of solving all the world's problems. So anyway, with that, I think I'll wrap up for today on the very positive note of a higher form of intelligence, and then just to mention very briefly the higher form of intelligence squared, as represented here, as you can watch in the big picture part 2, which I go through in a pretty concise way, bringing in machines and developing this new partnership between people and machines. All right. With that, I'll let y'all go. Thank you so much for joining me, and I look forward to doing many more of these recorded Hangouts with many other folks. I'm just kind of starting where I am, which is right here today on a Thursday morning, a day before I fly off to Japan. And part of the motivation is to get a bunch of this information and perspective in the hands of my partners in Japan, who I'm about to meet with. So thank you all again for watching, and hope you're all doing well, and look forward to seeing you soon. Thank you so much.